Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel. Today I have a very fun, exciting video, or at least I hope it is. I'm very excited to film this. Well, yesterday I was thinking about what to film today, and I was thinking, well, I haven't done a recommendations video in like a while. I've mostly been doing like vlogs and stuff or wrap-ups, and I was like, what could I recommend? And it kind of like hit me that I do read a lot of books that are set in a historical period that aren't necessarily focused on the history of it all. Here are some books that are historical fiction blends. Basically, they are historical fiction and something else. For example, I had thought maybe putting one of the books that I have down here, Wolf Hall by Hilary Mantel, but this is primarily historical fiction. Like, this is focusing on the historical, specifically the life of Thomas Cromwell. Like, I could say, well, it's kind of political intrigue. Like, maybe if you really like fantasy political intrigue, you might like this, but this is strictly like historical fiction. Like, I think the author put a lot of work into getting the most accurate history in this book while still it being like completely fictionalized. However, when I pick up historical fiction, I know that it's fiction. Like, I'm not looking for accuracy, which some of the books I'm going to recommend are probably not very accurate at all. But what I mostly like about historical fiction is how the author does or does not adhere to the themes, rules, or whatever have you of the period that she or he is writing in. So for example, if our main character is a young woman in the Victorian era, how does she conform or choose not to conform to what was actually expected of women during that time? You know what I'm saying? Basically, how does this author frame this period around their story, no matter how fictional it may be, fantastical, horror, sci-fi, whatever. That's what I like about having a time period that is not our own. Okay, so that's the premise. I hope I kind of checked off everything that I wanted to talk about before I actually start recommending books. I have a mix of YA and adult. I don't have any middle grade that I'm like dying to recommend. So we'll start with YA. There's 4 here. So let's start with fantasy. The first book I have is a series, and it is the His Fair Assassin series by Robin LaFevers. This takes place in the late 1400s in Brittany before it becomes a part of France. A big theme that you see throughout this book that is kind of just like woven in through the entire story is a French invasion, the threat of French invasion, as well as like the ever growing Catholicism. In this series, we follow 3 different girls. One woman is at the center of each book, and these 3 women live at a convent that still worships an older god, Saint Mortain, which is like their god of death. And occasionally throughout the series, we do kind of see visions of him, glimpses of him. He's by no means like a main character, but these girls are all his literal daughters. In the way that some gods like to mingle with mortals, we follow the daughters of death, and as their father, he's given them certain death-like gifts. I believe in the first book, Esme is given like the gift of like immunity to poisons or something along those lines. But these girls are all very skilled, and they're essentially assassins. If you are in any way intrigued by like assassin nuns, like this is a great YA series. The second book does get a bit dark, that I was like, is this really YA? Because there's some themes in the second book that was kind of intense. There's a lot of like political intrigue. Obviously there's fantasy elements, but there's also a romance at the heart of each and every single one. It is focused on the romance quite a bit. The second book also has a kind of Beauty and the Beast romance that I really enjoyed. This next book is also part of a series, a trilogy, and that is the Gemma Doyle trilogy by Libba Bray. This is A Great and Terrible Beauty, the first book. This is set in the late 1800s London. This series struck me very hard emotionally. In this series, we follow Gemma Doyle, who has grown up pretty much her entire life in India. However, at the beginning of the book, her mother dies in a very tragic way, and upon her death, Gemma starts seeing visions. She starts questioning her mother's entire life, but she just gets sent to a girls' academy, finishing school, whatever you want to call it, back in England. And there she meets a group of girls who would become, they're kind of frenemies. Like, they were never like at each other's throats too much, but they don't have like a cute, cozy, like girl power friendship or anything like that. They're all fairly unlikable women, but despite that, I mean, they're also teens, so like I don't like hating on, you know, young girls or whatever, but this is also a portal fantasy, and the things that these young women do while they are in this fantastical world, the things that they do in order to forget the shitty world that they live in. Mind you, they are for the most part like wealthy women of a higher class. They still know that their life is pretty crap. Not to spoil anything, but this whole series was basically one giant message about how the expectations that we put on young women, no matter what time period, no matter what like social class, whatever, is so incredibly harmful. The fact that these girls have to go into this portal fantasy in order to escape that, like, it just emotionally, like, it hits me. Like, I cried so much reading the first, second, and third books, just because they always like end on like a punch. If you also kind of like Gothic vibes, strong, very strong imagery, I highly recommend this trilogy. I'd also check some of the triggers for this. There is a few minor characters who are Romani, and there's a pretty liberal use of the G slur, so just keep that in mind. But since we just talked about Libba Bray, I might as well throw in one of my favorite books of all time, and that is The Diviners by Libba Bray. This takes place in 1920s New York City prior to the Great Depression. We follow a pretty wide range of characters here, but in the first book we follow a young girl named Evie who's come from a fairly conservative evangelical small town, and as punishment by her parents, she's like run out of town and sent to go live with her uncle in New York City, who kind of runs these like those like turn of the century as creepy crawly like occult museums. And while this is going on, there is a serial killer in New York City that's killing people in very like creepy occultish like ways, and the New York Police Department asks Evie's uncle if he could assist and lend some knowledge, since he does have an occult museum. Evie wants to take part in the investigation because she has a very unique ability, the ability that got her run out of town, where she can touch objects and see their history. So she's, as the title suggests, a diviner, but also, as the title suggests, there's going to be multiple diviners throughout the city. I really love the first book. It's my favorite so far. I haven't read books 3 and 4 because I haven't heard the best things about 4, so I'm nervous to continue. However, I do think that the second book in particular is very conscious of the setting, 1920s New York City, specifically when it comes to others, people who are not Christian and of Western European descent. This is a blend of like mystery, thriller, horror, paranormal, suspense. So our last YA book is also a paranormal type horror book, and that is In the Shadow of Blackbirds by Kat Winters. I read this very recently and it was such a trip, let me tell you, because this takes place during the Spanish influenza era, 1918, I think, California. So a couple things were happening during this era. The Spanish flu was running rampant. This was also during World War I. A lot of people were coming back either incredibly hurt or straight up dead. Edward Cullen also died in 1918. That was a moment in history as well. But we follow our main character, Mary Shelley, as she is being sent to go live with her aunt in California. Her father was recently arrested for saying some very like unpatriotic American things. As she arrives in California, she gets news that one of her longtime childhood friends, also like a young paramour of hers, has died in the war. Obviously this is a very emotional blow to her, but what she does not expect is this big paranormal turn of events to happen within her life. She's not a big believer in spiritualism, even though it's also very popular during this time. So we get a little bit of a ghost story. It is very eerie reading this while having been through the entirety of COVID. I don't know, like bitter, I guess, to read is that how everyone in this book reacts to the illness. Of course, some people don't always take it as seriously as someone else, but like at no point did you ever read like about illness deniers the same way that we have like COVID deniers and stuff like that. Lengths that people go to make sure that they are healthy, like taking either is it onion or garlic baths. Like it's wild. It's very like, it just felt very creepy to read, like more so than the actual like ghost paranormal stuff going on. So that's it for the like YA section. Let's get into some like adult historical blends. Let's start with the physical books that I own, and then I have some that I don't own, so we'll leave those towards the end. The first I have is The Broken Girls by Simone St. James. I really love this book. It's one of my favorite like mystery, is it thriller? I think it's more mystery. I honestly want to reread it because I read the majority of this on audiobook, and I kind of want to go back into it and like really absorb the entire, I want to just read it again. So The Broken Girls is a dual timeline story. Part of this does take place in the present timeline, but it also does take place in the 1950s in the past timeline. In the present timeline, we follow a young woman named Fiona whose sister passed away quite some time ago, and her body was found on this property. I believe someone did confess, but I think she's always had questions and she wasn't like ever fully convinced about like what truly happened to her sister. The location of where her sister's body was found is actually the setting of the past timeline. It is a boarding school that houses young troubled girls, I want to say, and we follow 4 girls in the 1950s at this boarding school who are just kind of trying to have the best lives possible. They have their own issues when one of those girls goes missing as well. So we have 2 tragic events going on and you see how they're connected. That's probably one of my favorite elements in like a mystery, is 2 different crimes and how they connect throughout time. Simone St. James also does occasionally put a kind of paranormal element into her books. So if you're not a fan of mysteries that kind of throw a paranormal twist, you know, keep that in mind for this. But I really enjoyed this. I've read one of her other works that I also really enjoyed. So the next book I have is a horror. I feel like this author was fairly popular like when he had a few books out, but now that more of his stuff has come out, I think he's become more divisive. Like, you either like him or you don't, and there's a lot of critiques about some of his work. I remember when his name was first getting thrown around and everyone was like, he's amazing, blah blah. I have My Best Friend's Exorcism by Grady Hendrix. Very popular horror author. I'm sure you can kind of guess what this story is about, but we follow 2 girls who've grown up together, and one of them starts acting very funny, very strange, and our main character believes her best friend is being possessed and might need an exorcism. This takes place in the late 80s. You will get pissed off reading this. There are a lot of unlikable elements. Again, this author was very conscious about putting in certain elements of this time period, not just like the cool 80s Stranger Things as type vibes, but also like the Satanic Panic, Reagan era parents. That's also a big thing here, but I really enjoyed it. Very gruesome at parts. I really enjoy close female friend relationships, sister relationships in books, and I really liked this one. There were a lot of moments when I was reading this that I was like, you know what, like I love My Best Friend too, but if they put me through some of the stuff, like I would think about dropping them. But our main character absolutely would do anything for her best friend, and I really liked reading that, and I was kind of surprised at how well it was done. The next book I have is from a very popular author. It's also a crime noir type story, and that is Velvet Was the Night by Silvia Moreno-Garcia. This takes place in 1970 Mexico City, I want to say. In this book we follow our main character Maite, and the author really wants you to know that Maite is the most dowdy, the most unassuming, the most boring, exciting person that has ever lived. When we were being introduced to the main character of this book, I thought that Miss Silvia had like a vendetta against Maite because she was like dragging her to high heavens. But Maite is a very boring person. She has a very boring job, doesn't have a lot of friends, doesn't have a great relationship with her family. The only thing that she really is excited about is like music and like romance novels. And then one day her neighbor, who is the exact opposite of her, like young, beautiful art student, whatever, asks our main character to watch over her apartment for a few days. And so our main character is like, yeah, sure, why not, I can do that. But then her neighbor never returns, and then Maite gets involved in this big crime conspiracy. It's a very short book, but I thought it was as fleshed out as it needed to be. I mean, if it was like 50 pages longer, I would have liked that too. I love Silvia Moreno-Garcia's writing. The historical themes that are going on in this book that I don't see explored too much, like they're always kind of hinted at but never explicitly said, is that there are a lot of younger, left-leaning, politically minded youths in Mexico City, and the powers that be are very worried about the political changes that could be had if the tides were to shift, the tides were to turn. And I feel that like right now, post Roe v. Wade, it feels kind of similar to that. Obviously this is 1970s Mexico and they have their own political issues going on at the time, but I like that. I like when an author is like conscious and is basically saying, hey, like these younger generations in general, not all of them, but in general, they're going to be leaning a certain way politically, and some of the older folk might not be ready for it. And since I was just talking about her, yes, you should read Mexican Gothic. Yes, it is very good. Yes, it is very creepy. Yes, there is dark imagery, but I loved it. It is horror about colonialism, about eugenics, and I am a little bit biased because the main character does have my mother's name. It's a very pretty name. I wish I was named that because I was going to be named that. So I'm going to get out of the way a book that I know a lot of people won't like, but I would not be me if I didn't recommend it to someone who might be interested in it. Again, probably won't, but it is A Lady of Rooksgrave Manor by Kathryn Moon. This is first and foremost an erotic romance. If you're not into very graphic sexual content, then skip past this recommendation because you probably won't like it. This takes place in the Victorian era. I don't remember if it was really ever clear like what specific dates. Not that's important. In this book we follow a young woman who's been given like her 2 weeks notice. She was like a maid in a home, but the homeowners are now moving somewhere near the country and she's gonna need to look for a job, and then she finds an opportunity to go work essentially at what is like a brothel for men that are not necessarily human. This is a monster romance. There is a Jekyll Hyde type character, there is a sphinx, there are vampires, there is werewolves, I think there's like an invisible man or something. Like, it is very much mostly the relationships that they have, particularly underneath the sheets. Not a huge plot. There's eventually a plot kind of thrown in at the end. I am very eagerly awaiting the next book that she writes because she does, I've read her other Lola and the Millionaires, whatever, she wrote that book as well. There's something, when she puts her pen to paper, goodness comes out, erotic goodness comes out, and I really enjoy it. If that's not your thing, that's totally fine. One thing I want to note about this book that I really enjoyed and I want to see more people utilizing it is that our main character truly loves having sexual relationships with other people, and the way that it's portrayed is not one of two ways that usually bothers me. The girl who's ashamed about loving sex, I don't like that portrayal. There's nothing shameful about it. Even if she does go through a whole like sexual liberation journey, I just don't care to see it. I also don't really like the girl who's like, I'm a bad girl because I like it. Both of these types of women who like sex think that there is something inherently wrong with it, and it frames the way they see themselves. I don't like either of those. Our main character really enjoys it. She doesn't really think twice about it, and I really enjoyed that. So I have another kind of romance, and that is the Paper Magician series by Charlie and Holmberg. I picked these up like on a whim because I just thought that the covers looked really cute and they were on Kindle Unlimited. I binged through this first original trilogy so quickly. The books are fairly short as well, but I really didn't know what I was getting into. It is like the most quaint, the most adorable, like fantastical Victorian era series, fantasy series, placed in a world where magic does exist, but it's kind of tied to certain materials. There are paper magicians, there are like metal magicians. I don't remember like the full extent of the world magic wise. It has been a while since I read it. Eventually, with the invention of plastic, the author wrote a plastic magician book, but the original trilogy follows our main character who really wanted to be a magician that specializes in metal, I believe, but then she was given paper, which meant that she could only have magic tied to working with paper. But then she does get assigned to a mentor that also specializes in paper. It's the most adorable series ever. It's very quick, it's very short. If you like mentor-mentee relationships, because the romance does bloom between these two people, I suggest looking at this one. If you're uncomfortable with a mentor-mentee relationship, if you think it like might veer too much or it's like teacher-student thing, if that makes you uncomfortable, that's totally fine too. If I remember correctly, like it's almost like a PhD level student. It's not like an undergrad, but I just really enjoy like our main character learning how to like make paper magic. It's the cutest thing ever. I tried to kind of vary like the time period and the setting of these recommendations, but like naturally, because it's a very popular setting, Victorian England, it just comes up a lot. So I have one more Victorian England setting and then we'll be done with that. We'll be done with that setting. So I have the Lady Sherlock series, the first being A Study in Scarlet Women by Sherry Thomas. This is a mystery series, a reimagining of the Sherlock Holmes stories. This follows a Lady Sherlock that's essentially it. It's a mystery series. Our main character, Scarlet, has created the Sherlock Holmes character in order to like work crimes either like independently or alongside Scotland Yard. There's also kind of like quirky funniness to the author's writing that I really enjoyed. There's moments where I actually kind of like laughed out loud, which I typically like don't do, not because the author was trying to crack a joke, but just kind of how ridiculous some of the stuff that Scarlet gets up to. I really enjoyed it. It has a sister relationship here that I really enjoyed. It's been quite a while since I've read these. I read the first 3 and I kind of want to reread them to just get back into it and really appreciate the story again. So we have 2 more books. Both of them are fairly recent reads. First one being River of Teeth by Sarah Gailey. This takes place in 1890s Louisiana. The premise of this is very funny and something directly taken from American history. I believe in the 1900s there was this bright idea to introduce hippopotamus into Louisiana. In this book we follow Winslow Houndstooth, who's been given a job by the US government, and that job is to clear out the Mississippi River that is full of feral hippopotamus. And so he gets this like ragtag group of characters together in order to do that. This is a novella, but it felt incredibly fleshed out for how short it was. It's more in the lines of a Western. What I really liked about this book, and it's such a good little detail, but like these people, instead of like riding horses everywhere, they ride hippopotamus everywhere, and it's so cute. There's also a bit of a revenge story going on here as well. Someone has hurt Winslow in the past and he's trying to get revenge. So I recommend this to everyone because it's so short. You can't really like, it's not like a waste of your time if you just like it. Again, these hippopotamus are feral, so there's some body horror stuff. One more book and then I'm done. I don't usually film this long. I'm getting really tongue-tied here. I'll be able to edit everything out so you guys don't see me floundering here. But anyways, the last book is probably one of the best books I've read so far this year. This has been a pretty mid reading year, but I really appreciate this one for a few things, and that is Siren Queen by Nghi. I've never read Nghi. I know that their writing is very decorative and pretty, which is why I've strayed so far away from it, but I really wanted to give her a try, so I picked up Siren Queen. I got an arc and I really enjoyed it. This takes place in pre-code Hollywood, so the code was implemented in 1934, so prior to that year. And we follow our main character, who is Chinese American, and she is absolutely in love with movies. She loves everything about movies. She would go to the movies with her sister, and she wants nothing more than to be like not only in films but to like be a star, which is already tough in general, but it's going to be much more difficult for her being Chinese American. One of my favorite female characters I've ever read from. She is so incredibly determined to do what she wants to do. Hollywood itself is already filled with some very predatory practices, but this author kind of turns it up a little bit and really literally puts monsters in charge of Hollywood. There are like beasts that run certain studios and all that kind of stuff that will make anyone do anything for stardom. How our main character maneuvers these monsters is very, I have to like commend her for the things that she does and the things that she sacrifices. She's a real tough cookie, and I really enjoyed reading from her. I don't typically like root for characters so much the way that I rooted for our main character here. I wanted the best for her, and reading the ending and like what happens at the end with her, I was just like yeah, like she did it. Like she did that. Things that she did, that. And the reason why I really appreciate this book is, like what I said earlier, Nghi's writing is not something that I typically would enjoy. I do not like very decorative, pretty, prosy, purple prose type writing. It's not my thing. I think it distracts from the story. At least for me, it distracts me. But despite her writing, I still appreciated and loved this story. It feels very magical realism, but it's not. Like the things that are happening. It seems like a little too far-fetched and a little dreamy at times. I think it's one of the most like beautiful books I've read. Mind you, again, I try not to like go for beautiful books, but I really appreciated this one. So those are all the recommendations I have for you all. I didn't put some books here that, while would have fit, I don't think they needed to be recommended. For example, I like seriously thought, and like don't drag me for this, but I seriously contemplated putting The Infernal Devices by Cassandra Clare, but I didn't because it's Cassandra Clare. Who needs to be recommended? Her. in 2022. You know what I'm saying? Like, that being said, like, that Infernal Devices series, it's actually really good. Feel free to drag her in the comments. I always love a good Cassandra Clare drag. As I was saying, those are all my historical fiction blend recommendations that I have for you all. Feel free to talk to me below in the comments. Talk to me. Have you read any of these? Have you liked them? Disliked them? Do you have any historical fiction and something else recommendations that you want to give out to give to me, perhaps? I'd like to hear anything you have to say in the comments down below. I will link my socials as well as some far more important links down below as well. Feel free to like, dislike, comment, or subscribe, or do neither. It's all cool with me. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Peace out.